The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a blood-red sunset, painted in shades of copper and burnt orange that spoke of violence and survival. The year was 1876, and this land still tasted of gunpowder and death. Out here, where civilization ended and the wild began, only the strong carved out their piece of earth and held it against all who would take it away. Jack Morrison's hands gripped the shovel like a weapon, sweat cutting trails through the dust on his weathered face. At 42, he carried himself like a man who had seen the elephant and lived to tell about it. His shoulders bore the weight of command, even though his cavalry uniform now hung forgotten in a trunk that hadn't been opened in 5 years. The hole beneath his boots grew deeper with each violent thrust of the blade. 3 feet down. 4. The metallic ring of steel against stone echoed across the empty landscape like gunshots in the dark. But Jack Morrison wasn't digging a grave tonight. He was bearing a secret that had haunted him since the day 30 brave soldiers died screaming his name. The leather saddlebags beside the hole bulged with gold coins that caught the dying light like fallen stars. Army payroll. Blood money. The last cargo his cavalry unit had died protecting at Apache Pass, when the world exploded in war cries and muzzle flashes and the screams of horses and men. Jack's memory painted the scene in crimson, the narrow canyon walls, the thunder of hooves, Captain Rex Collins shouting orders that no one could hear over the Apache war cries. Then the silence that followed, broken only by the buzzing of flies and Jack's own ragged breathing as he crawled from beneath his dead horse. 30 men, all dead, all except Jack Morrison, who carried their gold and their ghosts across 5 years of sleepless nights. A distant gunshot cracked across the territory, sharp as a whip. Jack's head snapped up, eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced alertness of a man who had learned that survival meant never truly relaxing. The shot came from the direction of town, probably some drunk cowboy celebrating payday, but in this country, probably could get a man killed. He wrapped the saddlebags in oilcloth and lowered them into the earth like a coffin. Each shovelful of dirt that followed felt like a small burial, covering not just gold, but the weight of command decisions in the faces of men who had trusted him to bring them home. When the last stone was placed and the ground looked untouched by human hands, Jack Morrison straightened and brushed the dust from his clothes. Tomorrow his children would ask why he'd been gone so long. Tomorrow he'd teach his son to shoot straighter and his daughter to ride harder, because this land demanded strength from everyone who called it home. But tonight, he was just a man trying to bury his war. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Morrison ranch, painting the buildings in harsh angles of light and darkness. Jack stood on his porch, coffee steaming in his tin cup, watching his children prepare for another day in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. Beth Morrison, 16 and fierce as her father, checked the cylinder of her Colt revolver with practiced efficiency. She had inherited Jack's steel-gray eyes and his unwillingness to back down from anything that breathed. Her younger brother Tommy, 12 years old but already showing the makings of a man, adjusted the rifle sling across his shoulder with the careful attention to detail that Jack had drilled into him since he could walk. "Remember what I taught you," Jack called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in life-and-death situations. "Trust nothing that moves. Question everything that doesn't." Beth nodded once, sharp and military. "Yes, sir." Tommy's face lit up with the eager enthusiasm of a boy desperate to prove himself worthy of his father's respect. "We'll check every head of cattle and ride the full perimeter, Pa." "See that you do." Jack's tone softened just enough to remind them that beneath the sergeant was a fighter who would move heaven and earth to keep them safe. "And if you see anything that doesn't belong, anything at all, you ride hard for home and you don't look back." The children mounted their horses with the fluid grace of those born to the saddle. Beth's paint mare and Tommy's buckskin gelding were chosen not for beauty, but for speed, endurance, and the kind of heart that wouldn't quit when the chips were down. In this country, a good horse meant the difference between life and death more often than most people wanted to think about. Jack watched them ride toward Copper Ridge until they disappeared into the heat shimmer, then turned his attention to the work that never ended: fences to mend, wells to dig, the endless battle against a land that tested every man who dared to call it home. But as he reached for his tools, something made him pause. A feeling, the kind of instinct that had kept him alive when 30 other soldiers had perished. His eyes swept the distant ridge line, searching for movement, for the glint of sunlight on metal, for anything that didn't belong in the natural rhythm of the territory. Nothing. But Jack Morrison had learned to trust his instincts more than his eyes. He checked his sidearm, made sure his rifle was within easy reach, and began his day with the careful awareness of a man who knew that death rode these trails disguised as ordinary morning. Beth and Tommy found the Apache warrior 4 hours into their ride. At the bottom of Copper Ridge, where the shadows ran deep and the prairie winds whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen, the young man lay crumpled against a boulder like a discarded rag doll, his breathing shallow and labored. Dark stains had painted the rocks around him in rusty patterns that spoke of violence and desperation. His buckskin shirt was torn and soaked through, and the eagle feather in his black hair was bent and broken. Tommy's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Beth grabbed his wrist with a grip like iron. "Wait!" Her voice carried the same calm authority she had learned from her father. "Look at him, Tommy. Really look." The Apache's weapons were gone. No knife, no bow, no war paint. And most telling of all, his wounds weren't from bullets or blades. They were from arrows. Apache arrows. "His own people did this," Beth whispered, understanding flooding her face like sunrise. "They shot him and left him to die." Tommy's young face struggled to process what he was seeing. But why would... Because sometimes a man has to choose between his tribe and what's right. Beth dismounted and approached the wounded warrior with the careful steps of someone who understood that cornered animals, human or otherwise, were the most dangerous of all. And sometimes that choice gets you killed. The Apache's eyes opened as she drew near. They were dark as midnight and filled with the kind of pain that went deeper than flesh and bone. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but the words came in clear English. "Leave me. Death is what I have earned." Beth knelt beside him, her hands already moving to examine his wounds. "That's not your choice to make, mister. Not today." The young warrior's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected kindness from the daughter of his enemy. "You do not understand. Your people and mine... My people and your people have been killing each other since before I was born," Beth interrupted, her voice matter-of-fact. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to let a man bleed to death in front of me. My mother didn't raise me that way." Tommy approached slowly, his rifle still ready, but no longer pointed at the Apache. "Pa's not going to like this, Beth. You know what happened to him in the war." Beth's jaw set with stubborn determination that would have made Jack Morrison proud and terrified in equal measure. "Pa taught us that a Morrison never turns their back on someone in need, even if that someone might be our enemy." She began tearing strips from her own shirt to make bandages, her movements quick and efficient. "Tommy, ride back to the house. Tell Pa what we found and that we're bringing him home." "Beth, I can't leave you alone with... He's half dead and unarmed." Beth's voice carried the kind of finality that ended arguments. "Besides, if he wanted to hurt me, he could have done it already. Now go." Tommy hesitated for another heartbeat, then spurred his horse toward home, riding hard across the desert floor like his sister's life depended on his speed. Which, Beth realized as she worked to stop the Apache's bleeding, it probably did. Jack Morrison's face could have been carved from granite when Tommy's horse thundered into the ranch yard, lathered with sweat and wild-eyed from the hard ride. The boy's words came in a rush of excitement and fear, painting a picture that made Jack's pulse quicken with old battlefield instincts. Apache warrior, wounded. Beth's with him, bringing him home. For a moment, Jack stood perfectly still, processing information with the mechanical precision of a soldier receiving a battlefield report. Then his body moved with sudden, violent purpose. He strapped on his gun belt, checked his rifle, and saddled his black stallion with movements so sharp they seemed to cut the air. "Stay here," he commanded Tommy, his voice carrying the iron authority of a man who expected instant obedience. "If we're not back by sundown, you ride for town and you don't stop until you find the sheriff." The ride to Copper Ridge passed in a blur of dust and pounding hooves. Jack's mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. Apache raiding parties. Ambush. His daughter lying dead beside some warrior's war trophy. The images burned through his consciousness like acid. But when he crested the ridge and saw Beth walking slowly across the desert floor, supporting a wounded Apache warrior who could barely stand, Jack Morrison felt something shift inside his chest. Not relief, not anger, something more complicated that he didn't have a name for. He dismounted 20 yards away, his rifle held ready but not quite pointed at the Apache. The warrior raised his head and met Jack's eyes with a steady gaze that showed no fear, only a kind of weary acceptance. "Father," the Apache said in English that carried only the slightest accent, "I am called Nalnish. Was son of Cochise. I do not ask for mercy. I ask only that you do not punish your daughter for showing kindness to an enemy." Jack's finger tightened on the trigger as 5 years of nightmares crashed through his mind. Apache Pass, the screams, the spilled blood of 30 good soldiers who had trusted him to bring them home. But Beth's voice cut through the fury like a blade through silk. "Pa." Her tone was quiet but unbreakable. "He was cast out by his own people. They shot him with their own arrows and left him to die. A man who's been betrayed by his own kind. That's not our enemy. That's someone who understands what it means to stand alone." Jack stared at the Apache, at Nalnish, and saw something in those dark eyes that he recognized. The look of a soldier who had been asked to do things that went against everything he believed in. The look of a man who had chosen honor over safety and paid the price in blood and exile. Slowly, carefully, Jack lowered his rifle. "One wrong move," he said, his voice quiet as death. "One single wrong move, and I'll put you in the ground so deep they'll need a mining crew to find your bones." Nalnish nodded once, a slight smile touching the corner of his mouth. "That is fair, soldier." The word hit Jack like a physical blow. Soldier, not enemy, not target. Recognition from one warrior to another. As they helped the wounded Apache onto Jack's horse, Beth caught her father's eye. "Ma would have done the same thing," she said softly. Jack Morrison looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw not a child, but a young woman who understood that sometimes mercy was the hardest choice of all. And sometimes it was the only choice that let a man sleep at night. "Yeah," he said finally. "She would have." Part 2. Enemies at the Gate. The Morrison Ranch house had never sheltered an Apache warrior before. Jack cleared out the small room behind the kitchen that had once served as his wife's sewing room, spreading clean blankets on the narrow bed, and trying not to think about the irony of an Apache sleeping where Sarah Morrison had once hummed lullabies while mending his cavalry uniform. For 3 days, Nalnish drifted in and out of consciousness like a man walking the borderland between life and death. Jack found himself checking on the warrior throughout each night, not from kindness but from the cold practicality of a man who knew that wounded enemies could be the most dangerous of all. The fever broke on the 4th morning. when dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. Nalnish's breathing came easier, and when he opened his eyes, they held a clarity that made Jack's hand move instinctively toward his sidearm. "You could have killed me while I slept," Nalnish observed, his voice stronger than it had been since Beth found him. "Many of your people would have considered it justice." Jack leaned against the doorframe, his rifle cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. "Many of your people would have scalped my children and burned my house. Doesn't mean it's the right thing to do." A ghost of a smile touched Nalnish's lips. "You think like a warrior, not a killer. There is a difference." "Is there?" Jack's voice carried the weight of 5 years' worth of questions he'd never dared ask. "At Apache Pass, when your people came down on us like the wrath of God, were you thinking like a warrior then?" The smile died on Nalnish's face, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Apache Pass." He repeated the words like a curse. "You were there." "I was there." Jack's voice was steady as mountain stone. "Watched 30 brave men fall in the dirt, crawled out from under my dead horse, and walked 20 miles through hell with their memory burning in my mind." Nalnish struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "The attack on your soldiers. It was planned by my brother Tasai. He told our war council that your men carried gold. Enough gold to buy weapons for 1,000 warriors." Jack's heart stopped beating for a full second. "How did he know about the payroll?" "Someone told him." Nalnish's eyes met Jack's with deadly seriousness. "Someone who wore the same uniform you wear. Someone who wanted your men dead and the gold for himself." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Betrayal. From within his own unit. From someone who had shared campfires and swapped stories and sworn the same oath to protect and defend. "Who?" The word came out as barely more than a growl. "A man with the mark of command. Older. Gray in his hair. He came to our camp 3 days before the attack. Spoke with Taze in secret." Nalnish's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if sharing the burden made it lighter. "I argued against the ambush, said it was murder, not war. Taze called me weak, said I had the heart of a woman." Jack's mind raced through the faces of his command structure. Captain Collins, Lieutenant Hayes, Sergeant Major Thompson, men he had trusted with his life, men who might have traded 30 soldiers' lives for a chance at Army gold. "Why are you telling me this?" Jack asked. Nalnish met his gaze without flinching. "Because I tried to warn your men, rode ahead of the war party, tried to signal danger, but I was too late. And when I returned to my people and told them what I had seen, soldiers dying with honor while their own leaders betrayed them, they called me traitor to our cause." The Apache warrior's hand moved to touch the arrow wounds in his chest. "These were gifts from my own brother, for choosing your honor over Apache blood." Jack stared at this enemy who had tried to save his men. This warrior who had been cast out for showing mercy to soldiers he had never met. The world suddenly seemed less black and white than it had 5 minutes ago. Over the following days, as Nalnish regained his strength, an unlikely partnership began to form. The Apache taught Tommy how to read tracks in ways no white man had ever shown him. Not just the size and shape of prints, but the rhythm of movement, the signs of fear or confidence, the stories that footsteps told about the hearts of those who made them. "A frightened man drags his feet," Nalnish explained to the boy as they knelt beside the creek. "A confident man places his weight forward. A hunter moves with purpose. A hunted man moves with desperation." Beth learned different lessons. How to move through brush without making sound. How to find water in the driest places. How to read the wind for signs of weather and danger. "Your children have warrior hearts," Nalnish told Jack one evening, as they watched Beth and Tommy practice what they had learned, "but also the wisdom to know when not to use them. You have raised them well, soldier." Jack felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not just pride in his children, but something that felt almost like hope. For the first time in 5 years, the ranch felt less like a place to survive and more like a place to live. But hope, Jack had learned, was a dangerous luxury in this country. It was Tommy who first noticed the signs. Fresh horse tracks near the creek, made by shod horses carrying riders who knew how to stay hidden. Broken twigs at man height, disturbed ground where someone had knelt for a long time, watching. Pa, Tommy said, his young voice tight with controlled fear. Someone's been watching us. Jack examined the evidence with the practiced eye of a man who had learned that details meant the difference between life and death. Multiple riders, military formation, men who knew their business and weren't trying to hide their competence, only their presence. How long? Jack asked. 2, maybe 3 days, Nalnish replied, reading signs that Jack couldn't even see. They wait for something, a signal, an opportunity. Before Jack could respond, the sound of horses approaching fast made all 4 of them freeze. Not the steady rhythm of a single rider, but the thundering chaos of multiple horses moving at speed. Jack moved to the window, rifle ready, and felt his pulse hammer against his throat. 6 riders approached the ranch house in a loose formation that spoke of military training and bad intentions. They rode hard but controlled, like men who had done this kind of work before. At their head rode a figure Jack recognized even at a distance. Captain Rex Collins, his former commanding officer, the man who had sent Jack's unit into Apache Pass with orders that had gotten them all killed. "Company's coming," Jack said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "And they're not here for a social call." Nalnish struggled to his feet, moving with the fluid grace of a natural-born warrior despite his wounds. "The gold," he said simply. "They know you have it." Jack's jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. "How?" "Because," Nalnish replied, checking the knife at his belt with practiced efficiency, "whoever betrayed your men at Apache Pass has been watching you ever since, waiting for the right moment to collect what he believes belongs to him." The riders were close enough now that Jack could see Collins' face beneath the brim of his hat. The man looked older, harder, marked by years of whatever dark road he'd been traveling since the war. But his eyes still held the cold intelligence that had made him a good officer and apparently a dangerous enemy. "Beth, Tommy," Jack called out, "get to positions like we practiced." His children moved with the swift efficiency of soldiers who had drilled for this moment. Beth took her rifle and moved to the loft window that commanded the front yard. Tommy slipped out the back door to reach his position in the barn. No words were needed. No discussion. They had prepared for this day without knowing when it would come. "Pa!" Beth called down from the loft, her voice steady as bedrock. "I see them. 6 riders armed and ready." "Tommy's in position," came the boy's voice from the barn. "I've got a clear shot on the left flank." Jack looked at Nalnish and saw a warrior ready for battle, despite wounds that should have kept him bedridden for another week. "You don't have to do this," Jack said. "This isn't your fight." Nalnish's dark eyes held the cold fire of a man who had found his purpose. "Any man who betrays soldiers betrays the warrior's code. That makes it my fight." Outside, Captain Rex Collins called out in a voice that carried across the prairie like thunder. "Jack Morrison, I know you're in there, boy. Time we had ourselves a conversation about old times and debts that need settling." Jack Morrison checked his rifle one final time and walked toward the door, every step carrying him deeper into a confrontation 5 years in the making. Behind him, his family and his unlikely ally prepared for war. Part 3. Last Stand at Copper Ridge. The 6 riders spread out in a rough semicircle around the Morrison ranch house, their horses pawing the dusty earth like predators sensing wounded prey. Captain Rex Collins sat his mount with the easy confidence of a man who had orchestrated this moment down to the smallest detail. Jack Morrison stepped onto his porch alone, his rifle held casually but ready. To anyone watching, he looked like a man facing unwelcome visitors, not mortal enemies. But his finger rested on the trigger with the light touch of someone who had learned that hesitation killed. "Rex," Jack said, his voice carrying across the yard with deceptive calm. "Been a long time." Collins smiled, but it was the cold expression of a snake preparing to strike. "Not long enough, Jack. You're looking good for a dead man. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Jack's eyes swept the other riders, cataloging weapons and positioning with the automatic assessment of a veteran soldier. "Can't say the same for the 30 brave souls you sent to die at Apache Pass." Apache Pass. Collins shook his head with mock sadness. Terrible tragedy, that. Apache ambush. No survivors. Except you, of course. Lucky Jack Morrison, crawling out of hell with army gold in his saddlebags. The words confirmed what Jack had suspected and feared. Collins had orchestrated the massacre, trading soldiers' lives for the chance at stolen gold. But hearing it spoken aloud still hit like a physical blow. "How?" Jack asked. Collins' smile widened. "Simple enough. Tell a few Apache where to find a cavalry payroll. Let nature take its course. Clean up any loose ends afterward." His expression hardened. "Except you had to go and survive, didn't you, Jack? Always were too stubborn to die proper." "And the gold?" "That gold belongs to me, boy. Bought and paid for with blood and careful planning. You've just been keeping it safe." Collins gestured to his men, and they began to close the circle slowly. "Now it's time to pay what you owe." Jack's thumb moved to cock his rifle, the metallic click loud in the frontier stillness. "I don't owe you anything, Rex, but I've got 30 dead soldiers who might disagree with your arithmetic. 30 dead soldiers who died following orders. My orders." Collins' voice turned ugly. "Orders that made me rich enough to buy whatever justice I need." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made every man present freeze, the distinctive war cry of an Apache warrior, rising from somewhere behind the house like the voice of the territory itself. Collins' men wheeled their horses, searching for the source of the sound, weapons drawn and eyes wide with the sudden realization that they might not be the hunters in this situation. "What the hell was that?" one of them called out. "Apache," Collins said, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. "Jack, you son of a bitch, what have you done?" Before Jack could answer, Tommy Morrison appeared on the roof of the barn, his rifle trained on the nearest rider. His young voice carried clearly across the yard. "Mister, you'd best think real careful about your next move. My sister's got you in her sights from the house, and she shoots better than most men." As if summoned by his words, Beth's voice called out from the loft window. "Pa, they've got prisoners in that wagon." Jack's heart nearly stopped. Through the dust and horses, he could see a covered wagon he hadn't noticed before. And now he could hear what Beth had heard, the sound of people in distress. Collins had brought hostages. "The Hendersons," Collins called out, confirming Jack's worst fears. "Nice family. Good neighbors of yours, I believe. They'll stay nice and healthy as long as you hand over what belongs to me." Jack Morrison felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders. The terrible mathematics of war, where every decision carried the weight of lives hanging in the balance. Save the hostages and lose his family, or protect his family and watch innocent people die. But as he stood there calculating odds and angles, a third option presented itself in the form of Nalnish, stepping out of the shadows beside the barn, moving with the fluid grace of a ghost made flesh. The Apache warrior had shed his blood-stained clothes and painted his face with war paint made from desert clay and charcoal. He carried a war lance tipped with steel, and his eyes held the cold fire of a man who had found his purpose. "Collins," Nalnish's voice carried across the yard like thunder. "You are the one who betrayed these soldiers. You are the one who brought dishonor to both our peoples." Collins' face went white as bone. "Impossible. The Apache are all dead or scattered." "Not all," Nalnish replied. And then he was moving. What followed was not a battle but a lesson in why the Apache had held the frontier for so long against impossible odds. Nalnish seemed to flow across the ground like water, using every rock and shadow and bit of cover to devastating effect. Jack watched the warriors approach and understood the plan without words. Distraction, confusion. Divide the enemy and defeat them piecemeal. "Tommy," Jack called out, "when I say go, you put that guard down and get to cover." "Beth, take the left flank when the shooting starts." The Morrison family moved with the precision of a military unit, each member knowing their role without discussion. Jack had trained them well, but more than that, they fought with the desperate courage of people defending their home. The gunfight that followed was swift and brutal. Collins's men, confused by the Apache's war cries and the multiple angles of fire, found themselves caught in a crossfire they couldn't escape. Tommy's rifle barked once, and the man guarding the wagon toppled from his saddle with a neat hole through his chest. Beth's revolver spoke twice from the loft window, and another rider fell backward off his horse, his rifle spinning away into the dust. Jack himself moved with the cold efficiency of a professional soldier, his shots calculated and precise. But it was Nalnish who turned the tide, his war lance finding its mark in the heart of Collins' lieutenant, while the man was still trying to understand where the attack was coming from. In less than 3 minutes, 4 of Collins's men were down, and the survivors were spurring their horses toward the horizon with the desperate speed of men who had seen death reach for them and barely escaped its grasp. Only Collins himself remained, his horse dancing nervously in the center of the yard, his revolver trained on Jack with shaking hands. "This isn't over, Morrison," Collins called out, his voice cracking with rage and fear. "That gold is mine by right. I planned for it. I killed for it." "And you'll die for it," Jack replied calmly, "if you don't ride out of here right now." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Collins seemed to consider his options. Then his face twisted with desperate fury, and he spurred his horse forward, revolver blazing. Jack Morrison had been in enough gunfights to know that panic made men sloppy. Collins' shots went wild, chewing up dirt and splintering wood but finding no human targets. Jack's single shot took Collins' center mass, lifting him from his saddle and dropping him into the dust of the Morrison ranch yard like a sack of grain. The prairie quiet that followed felt different from any silence Jack had ever experienced. Not the quiet of fear or waiting, but the deep peace that came after a storm had passed and left the world clean in its wake. Tommy and Beth emerged from their positions, their faces flushed with adrenaline and the pride of people who had stood their ground when it mattered most. Nalnish walked among the fallen with the practiced efficiency of a warrior checking his kills. But it was the sound of crying from the wagon that reminded them all that the fight was about more than just survival. The Henderson family, husband, wife, and 2 small children, emerged from their prison with the shaky gratitude of people who had expected to die and found themselves suddenly, miraculously alive. "Thank you," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Oh, thank you all." Jack helped the family down from the wagon, his hands gentle despite their recent violence. "You're safe now, ma'am. We'll get you home to your folks." As they tended to the Hendersons and secured the ranch, Jack found himself standing beside Nalnish, watching his children help the traumatized family prepare for their journey home. "Your children fought well," Nalnish observed. "They have the hearts of warriors." "They have the hearts of good people," Jack corrected. "Sometimes that's the same thing. Sometimes it's not." Nalnish nodded slowly. "What will you do now, soldier?" The gold is still buried. Collins' men who escaped will return with others. Jack considered this. The smart thing would be to dig up the gold, take his family, and disappear into the vast spaces of the American frontier. Start over somewhere Collins' associates would never find them. But as he looked at his ranch, at the place where his wife had lived and loved and died, Jack Morrison made a different choice. "We stay," he said simply. "This is our home. We've bled for it, and we've earned it." He paused, looking at the blood-soaked earth where Collins lay still. As for the gold, well, maybe it's time that blood money did some good in this world. 3 days later, Jack Morrison rode into town with a story that would become legend throughout the Arizona Territory. He told the sheriff about Collins' betrayal, about the Apache warrior who had saved them all, and about his decision to donate the recovered Army payroll to build a school for the children of the territory. 30 good men died for that gold, Jack told the assembled townspeople. Seems fitting that their sacrifice should help raise the next generation to be better than the ones that came before. The school was built within 6 months, a sturdy structure of adobe and timber that stood as a monument to the idea that some things were worth more than money. They named it Apache Pass Memorial School, honoring both the fallen soldiers and the warrior who had helped bring justice to their killers. Nalnish chose to stay with the Morrison family, not as a guest or a prisoner, but as something new, a bridge between two worlds that had known too much war and too little understanding. He taught the local children, both white and Apache, the skills they needed to survive in a harsh land while building something better together. Beth Morrison grew into a woman whose reputation with a rifle became legend throughout the territory, but who was better known for her work establishing safe houses for families caught between the violence of two cultures. Tommy became a scout and peacemaker, using the skills Nalnish taught him to prevent conflicts rather than win them. And Jack Morrison found something he had never expected after Apache Pass: peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of a man who had turned his pain into purpose and his loss into legacy. Years later, when travelers passed through the Arizona Territory, they would tell stories of a ranch where a former cavalry sergeant, his fierce children, and an Apache warrior had built something new under the endless desert sky. A place where honor mattered more than blood, where family was defined by choice rather than birth, and where the ghosts of Apache Pass had finally found their rest. Some stories, they learned, were worth the telling. Some battles were worth the fighting, and some homes were worth whatever price the desert demanded for the privilege of calling them your own. The Morrison Ranch endured, as did the family that defended it, and in a land where survival was never guaranteed and justice was rare as rain, that was victory enough for any man. The end of one story, perhaps. But in the Arizona Territory of 1876, every ending was just another beginning, and every sunset promised that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new chances to prove what a person was truly made of. The end.